Okay.
Go. Hold on just a second.
Okay.
Hold on just a second. Alrighty, you are good to go.
Thank you. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome. Good evening. We're glad you could join us with our LWVOR, People Powered Fair Maps Day of Action. What we're offering is a course in Oregon redistricting. Folks have registered for this evening's presentation from Union, Eugene, Brookings, Dallas, Hood River, Ashland, Portland, from all over. We have much to cover and we want to answer your questions, so let's get started. Your presenters tonight are Becky Gladstone, the president of the League of Women Voters of Oregon, Norman Turrell, who's League of Women Voters of Oregon and the Action Committee and specialist in redistricting, and I'm Chris Kobe. I'm also working on redistricting for the League. The sound is muted on this, but if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A function located at the bottom of the screen. We will try to answer the questions as they come in or at the end of this presentation. We'll finish up in an hour and we look forward to answering any questions you have. Our agenda for this evening covers 5 major areas. What is redistricting? How is redistricting done in Oregon? What's happened so far in this process? What's likely to happen? And how can you make a difference in this process? The good news is you're aboard at a time when you can make a difference. And the process is picking up steam, and we'll explain why, but you still have many chances in different ways in which you can contact your legislators, media, and other outlets and be heard in this process. Our promise to you for this evening's presentation is that you will know more about Oregon redistricting and what you can do than when we started. Or at the very least, you're going to say, yes, in fact, I do know it all when it comes to Oregon redistricting. But we'll see if we can stump you. We've even got a quiz ahead of you there. So our partners in this presentation tonight are the local leagues and the units of the League of Women Voters of Oregon. That constitutes approximately 16 different entities. Also the group People, Not Politicians. You may remember that group from last year when they were spearheading with the League's help IP 57, the initiative that would have created an independent redistricting commission. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass, but we're still working hard on it. And also the NAACP of Eugene Springfield is also assisting us tonight in this presentation. So now let me turn this over to the League of Women Voters of Oregon President, Becky Gladstone, who will explain why and for how long we have sought redistricting reform in Oregon. Becky.
Thank you, Chris. You can hear all right?
Yes.
Audio is good? Okay, thanks. The National League of Women Voters is sponsoring this People-Powered Fair Maps campaign in all 50 states, building on decades of research, debate, and advocacy positions. Here are the features we want you to look for: the must, the should, and the as much as possible for redistricting plans. So redistricting plans must make districts with substantially equal populations and geographic contiguity, meaning that the parts must be connected. They must effectively represent racial and linguistic minorities, explicitly reject special treatment for an incumbent's address in setting the district lines, or a candidate's political party affiliation, voting history, and residence, and they must be enforceable in court. Every redistricting plan should include specific timelines for implementation, public hearings with full disclosure and public access at all levels and steps, and in case the process fails, have an established remedy, including court review with an enforceable timetable. Now, as much as possible, the redistricting plans should promote partisan fairness, preserve and protect communities of interest, and you'll hear more about that, and respect city and county boundaries. Those are the national positions. The Oregon League has vigorously advocated for redistricting for 15 years. We further emphasize redistricting plans should be developed independently of the legislature. We are particularly interested in supporting racial, ethnic, cultural, and other communities which are often underrepresented. The phrase you will be hearing from us is Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. That gives you the why of what we're doing here and why we're doing it. And now we want to turn a little bit to your engagement. Once you understand, or better understand, what we're doing in Oregon about the redistricting process, you have some choices to make. First, you get to find out who your legislators are if you don't already know them. And if you want to confirm who they are, I'm happy to, I will put in the chat function the location of a site where you can find out who your state representative and state senator are. Your methods of engagement are varied. These days, of course, with the pandemic, we are limited pretty much to not personal visits, but Zoom visits, but those can be effective. State legislators are frequently giving town halls, and those are the opportunities you have to either attend them live and ask the questions live, or to send the questions in advance to the legislators and have them think over the answers. What's their position on redistricting? What are they looking for? Let them know who you are, that you are a constituent who values their engagement in redistricting, and let them know how you'd like the process to proceed, including an independent redistricting commission. If you're represented by the major political party, you might find that a tough row to hoe because the majority is in control here, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you can also use letters, email, phone, all kinds of different ways. But the point is you should get involved as soon as you understand what a significant role redistricting is going to make in shaping your life and how funds are distributed here. That's going to be very, very important. It's also going to be more important even in August when the census data is released, and Norman's going to talk a little bit about that. The next month becomes even more crucial, September. That is when they're actually going to release the proposed maps and invite public comment in at least all of the 5 existing congressional districts. So let's find out what you know about redistricting. We've got 4 questions here, and you can put your answers in the Q&A or the chat feature, either one. What party is in control of the Oregon redistricting process this year? Let's take a look there and see if we've got some people who know which party is in control. Yes, we do. It is, in fact, the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party not only controls both chambers of the state legislature, it controls the Secretary of State. Norman's going to explain to you why the Secretary of State could be important in this process. And of course, the governor is a Democrat also. So the Democrats have what we call a trifecta in Oregon. And that's not true across the United States, but it's true here. Next question, how many new districts have to be drawn in this Oregon redistricting cycle? Now we're getting into a tougher question. Anybody got some ideas there? How many new districts do we have to draw? Let's take a look. Okay, some of you put down the answer of 90, which is close, but you have to add in the 6 new congressional districts. So the correct answer is 96 districts. What percentage of incumbent Oregon state legislators on the regular November ballot have been re-elected over the last 20 years? It's very good to be an incumbent Oregon state legislator in a general election, because what's your chance of getting re-elected? Over 97%, 97.4% to be exact. Last question, can you, in this redistricting cycle, submit your own proposed redistricting maps? Yes or no? Okay, some of you have said yes, that is correct. You can, with the caveat, if you're going to submit maps, and we'll talk about this later, those maps have to be complete for the state of Oregon. You can't just submit your redistricting plan for Bend or for Eugene or for the coast side. It has to be the entire state. So you have to do that. But you can be involved, and we'll explain why and how. So now we're going to turn to Norman Turrell. He's going to take it over from here. Norman is probably one of the most experienced people in the state of Oregon in redistricting. He also holds the distinction of being the first male to serve on the board of directors of the League of Women Voters of the United States, and so far the only male. All right, Norman, tell them what they need to know.
Thank you, Chris. We'll start off rather simple. What is redistricting? Well, it's very simple. It's the redrawing of state legislative districts, both House and Senate, and congressional districts, including the new 6th congressional district. This is not as easy as it may seem because people keep moving around. You may know that about 20% of the population moves every year. So even though these are drawn every 10 years after the census, they get very fast out of whack with the population. You will also see the term reapportionment when that's referring to the state level. That's actually the same thing as redistricting, and it is in fact the word that is used in the Oregon Constitution, and it refers actually to the process that used to be used in Oregon where legislative districts were allocated or reapportioned to counties. And some counties had more clout in that process than others, but for a couple of decades, the legislature actually refused to do that reapportionment to the counties, and the rural counties gained more and more power in the process. When reapportionment is referred to the congressional level, though, it's the process that Congress just went through where the seats in the Congress, all 435 in the House, are reallocated to the states. And that's the process that gave Oregon 6 legislative districts, congressional districts. Who does the redistricting in Oregon? Well, it's the legislature, also formerly known as the Legislative Assembly. When the legislature cannot agree on state legislative districts, then the process defaults to the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State has then about 6 weeks to do the redistricting on her own if she gets the chance. It seems unlikely in this process that the Secretary of State will get involved, at least at this level. If the legislature can't agree on congressional district maps, then by state statute and law, the judge panel of 5 judges is appointed by the Chief Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court, and they're supposed to do the congressional districts if the legislature fails. Again, it seems unlikely that that judicial panel will be appointed, but anything can happen. This is, of course, very important because it determines the partisan composition of both the state legislature and the congressional delegation in Washington, D.C. And it's very likely to have a partisan tinge to the outcome. There's some possibility that it will be a bipartisan agreement among the legislators, but we'll see what happens. This may happen because the House recently made a deal between the Democrats and the Republicans that they would give the Republicans 1 more seat on the redistricting committee in exchange for not having to read every bill in its entirety on the House floor. We'll see how that works out. The Senate is still has a partisan tinge to the redistricting committee. So what are the standards that we use for redistricting? There's 2 sets of standards, one from the federal level and another from the state level. Congress has decided in its wisdom that every district in Congress should have only 1 member in that district, and that the districts have to be contiguous, meaning they have to have all parts touching each other, can't be touching just at one point either. So it has to have some connection between all parts of the district. And lastly, the Congress passed the Voting Rights Act several years ago, which protects minority rights in the process and requires that wherever possible, minorities who have a majority in a certain area will have their own district. That's so-called minority-majority districts, or majority-minority districts, rather. Federal courts have decided that each district will have equal population. This was the famous one person, one vote decision back in the 1960s. And the populations, though, can deviate somewhat from one district to another. The courts have decided that congressional districts can't deviate more than 1% or so, but be as close as possible. And for state legislative districts, they've decided that they could deviate as much as 11%, but depending on the other criteria. Next slide. Oregon Constitution and the statutes provides another set of standards for the redistricting. Again, they have to be of equal population and contiguous, but it adds a requirement that every 2 House districts have to fit into 1 Senate district. That's so-called nesting requirement. Another requirement is that the districts have to follow, wherever possible, geographic and political boundaries. The geographic boundary, for example, is the Cascade Mountains. You don't want to have a district spanning those kinds of big barriers. Another barrier might be the Willamette River or other, even a highway might be a geographic boundary. Political boundaries are for state counties and cities, maybe even school districts. Another requirement is that the districts have to represent communities of common interest. Now, what is that? That's actually not well defined in the statute, but it's essentially what voters think is their community of common interest. You have to ask the voters as to what they think their area of common interest is, and it's then taken into account in the mapping process. And lastly, there's a requirement that all parts of the district be connected by transportation links. You notice that let's go back just a second. You notice that there's some of these are very nebulous and they're not well defined. And so the people who are drawing the maps have to use human judgment in the process. This is also why computers cannot do this process, because it takes a lot of trading between different standards in the process. Okay, you can go on now. Standards are not ranked, except that federal standards supersede any state standards. Then one of the standards is that we may not, the drawers or districts may not consider any person, candidate, or party in the process. We'll kind of come back to this one in a while. That's a sort of maybe. Things that are not standards are compactness and competitiveness. Compactness is kind of a throwaway standard that is used in some states. Gerrymandering is not about what the shape of the district is, but it's about the voters that are put in the district and how they vote in their for their representatives. Competitiveness is one that we in the Oregon positions think is important, but it's not a criteria now. If we ever get our initiative on the ballot and get it passed for an independent commission, competitiveness will be a district or a standard. And the results of all this, well, let's say that it's a complicated process requiring human input.
Okay, thank you, Norman. I'm going to just remind people what deadlines we have and what other ones may be coming up. This year, because of a decision of the Oregon Supreme Court, they suspended the constitutional limits and imposed other limits because the Constitution said they had to be done by July. And that wasn't going to happen because the population data from the Census Bureau on which the districts are based, which is normally released sometimes in February, is going to be released in mid-August. So we're about 6 months behind. The Oregon Supreme Court said to the legislature, you've got to get it done by September 27th. And if the legislature doesn't do it by that date, it defaults to the Secretary of State for the state legislative districts. She has a chance to do it. That's spelled out in the Constitution. Her districts, if she draws them, can then be challenged in court. All of these plans can and almost certainly will be challenged in court. For the new congressional districts, after a panel of 5 judges finishes its work in the fall, those districts could be final, but again, don't be surprised if they are challenged by court proceedings. And all this runs up into the deadlines that traditionally start as early as September of the year before a even numbered election, which is to say the primary next year will be in May. But some of the deadlines actually start coming in September. People used to be able to run for specific, they could file for districts then. Can't do that now because the districts won't be decided probably until close to the end of the year and maybe early next year. So there is a timetable to this. I'll be happy to share with you in the chat links to the legislature site, which has a kind of timeline in it too for redistricting, and other sources where you can get information on that. How is this done? Well, it's by the timetable that we've talked about and the timetable that is being developed. This is a very fluid situation and it will continue to be fluid. What we don't know, for example, is you've heard that the minority party has engaged in walkouts in the past. As a matter of fact, 20 years ago, when redistricting came up, it was the party that's now in the majority was then in the minority that walked out. So walkouts are used because Oregon is one of, I believe, 4 or 5 states in the union that has a 2/3 requirement for a legislative quorum. And that is just a recipe for mischief. And that can be a problem. The legislature will also be passing bills, probably resetting the guidelines of the deadlines. As a matter of fact, Norman was telling me they just did a gut and stuff of some bills today, and they're probably going to change them into bills that will give more deadlines here. So it's something you have to sort of keep your eyes on to see what's happening. The next item is what's happened so far. Norman, do you want to tell them about that?
Sure. Well, this has been a wild year, as everybody knows, and it's been particularly wild for the census and redistricting processes. Besides the pandemic, there's been storms and wildfires and an administration at the national level that's actively tried to impede the census process. And that's all come to fruition with the late delivery of the data. And as you heard that just yesterday, the 6th congressional district was allocated to Oregon. That was supposed to be that announcement should have happened back in February sometime. And the data that should be delivered by April 1st will now be delivered sometime in mid-August. So everything's delayed by several months. So all the deadlines have been now shifted by the Oregon Supreme Court. The legislative committees have been created in both House and Senate. Then they've been working diligently. They've had some 13 hearings since February, gathering input from voters, especially about communities of common interest. And there's been other informational hearings that they've had in those committees. And there will undoubtedly be future hearings, and we'll get into that in a little bit as to what happens next. The end of the session happens in late June. The constitutional deadline is, I think, July 2nd. As I just said, we get the census data in mid to late August. After that, the legislative committees can go into proposing maps. After that, by state law, there's supposed to be 5 public hearings about the proposed maps. In the committees will probably meet concurrently between the 2 committees. The 2 committees then have to adopt the maps. The maps then have to go to the floor of both houses of the legislature and be adopted and signed by the governor by September 27th. Now, this is not necessarily going to happen because number of things can go wrong. And we'll get into that in a minute. But it's essentially a bill, a regular bill in the legislature that has to be passed with these maps. After that, anybody can sue in Marion County Court, and that court case immediately goes to the Oregon Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court decides that something's wrong, that the criteria have not been followed or they've missed something, then the court orders the Secretary of State to correct the maps. At least that's what happens with legislative districts. The process is somewhat different for congressional districts, but it also eventually goes to the courts. And when all of this is said and done in early next year, the maps have to go to the county clerks. And this is no easy task. The clerks have to sort through all those new boundaries and put the voters in those districts, set new precincts perhaps, and so on. So they've got a lot of work to do once the maps are passed in preparation for the next election, which will be in May. What could possibly go wrong with this process? Well, all sorts of things. One of the first things is that every legislator has a conflict of interest in the process. They should not be setting the boundaries of their own districts because they're essentially choosing the voters who will then vote for them. And we think, of course, that the voters should be choosing their representatives instead of the other way around. Also, redistricting has often been used for punishing or rewarding legislators in the process. I know of at least one legislator who was districted out of their seat in the 2011 redistricting, and he was pissed. That often happens. That's part of the legislative back and forth. Gerrymandering. There's 3 kinds of gerrymandering that can happen: partisan, racial, and bipartisan. Well, you probably understand this pretty well by now, having been astute followers of the news, but partisan gerrymandering is where the dominant party tries to get as many districts as it can to elect its own members. Racial gerrymandering is where people of color or other minorities are either packed or cracked into as few districts as possible, or cracked into as many districts as possible so as to dilute their voting strength. Now, bipartisan is actually quite different. Bipartisan gerrymandering is where the 2 parties get together and say, we both agree to draw the boundaries such that we trade safe districts for our voting strength to be maintained. And we think that that's in fact what happened in 2011, at least partially. There was 3 or 4 districts that became less competitive in the process in 2011. And that was a very similar situation to what we have now. At that time, the House and Senate had equal members on the 2 districting committees of the 2 parties, and they essentially agreed to settle so that the process would not default over to the Secretary of State, who at that time was Kate Brown. So they didn't want Kate Brown to be drawing the boundaries of the districts. And so the Republicans were highly motivated to come to an agreement. And we think the result of that was at least a partial bipartisan gerrymander. Another thing can go wrong is that the redistricting committees may attempt to draw preliminary maps using ACS data. That's the American Community Survey data from the Census Bureau. It's redone every year or so, and it's not far from the census results, but it's different. But it will give you a pretty good estimate of where the boundaries might be using that preliminary data. And then the process of drawing maps themselves could go on for a long time if the committee members can't agree. And if they fail, of course, then it goes to the Secretary of State. The standards for redistricting aren't always clear. I've mentioned the community's common interest, and choice of geographic boundaries is another unknown. That's something that you have to use judgment on, and so on. So there's a lot of judgment involved in the redistricting process that has to be sorted through. And then another thing that can go wrong is that there's not a lot of time between receiving the data from the Census Bureau in August and the September 27th deadline for agreeing on the maps. And that time will be used for public input on the draft maps. I've mentioned the 5 hearings that are necessary, but anybody can submit a map. The committees have said that they are intending to give training on using mapping software. The software is one known as ESRI, E-S-R-I. And there's quite a number of other mapping software systems out there that you can use to draw your own maps and give them to the committees to see if they want to consider them. And then finally, there's some legislative things going on. The Republicans have submitted a bill called HJR 7, which is very similar to IP 57 that the League supported as an initiative last year. And the League and the People for Fair Maps, People Not Politicians organizations have now filed a new initiative, IP 16. And we think between the two of those that there might be some room for negotiation with the legislature or the powers that be there. It would be nice if they would refer to the voters a constitutional amendment implementing a independent redistricting commission, but don't anybody hold your breath, please.
On that, Norman, going back to the Standards for Redistricting, Donna, who's participating in this, made the comment that the idea of common interest, communities of common interest, where the average size of a congressional House district is over 700,000 is pretty bizarre. And that's true, but the legislature still wants to hear from people as to what they think their communities of interest are. And there have been some pretty sophisticated presentations by Oregon residents as to what they consider to be their community. And it's important that your legislator know what that is for you. For example, there's a district in the city of Portland that takes in a section of the north portion of the city of Portland, and it's in a congressional district. That congressional district also contains Sheridan, Astoria, and the Oregon coast. What communities of common interest are there between urban Portland and Sheridan? It doesn't seem to fit. And if you look at a map of that district, you'll see that the district comes down into what looks like a little tooth or a proboscis. And it makes you wonder why that section of Portland was tied up with the Oregon coast. There are other illustrations of that just by looking at the maps, and we're going to take a look at it later. So this kind of information is very important, and your legislators want to hear from you as to where you'd like the lines to be drawn. Now,
so this concept of communities of common interest isn't terribly applicable to congressional districts. But when it gets down to the smaller legislative districts, it becomes quite important.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the same thing happens in that particular district. The northern area of the city of Portland is on the extreme eastern edge, and it runs over the Tualatin Mountains and into Washington County. So, you know, there were some decisions made 10 and 20 years ago that you have to wonder, why did they do it that way? So we'll see. Now we're going to step back. And for those of you who are just grasping what this is like, we've got something that we can show you here. And I'm going to take a look at what the next slide is. If I can move it forward. There we go. Take a look at this.
Partisan redistricting, or gerrymandering, is about fractions, percentages. These coins represent voters in an evenly divided state, 50 dimes, 50 pennies. These 100 coins elect 10 representatives. That means each voting district must contain 10 coins. Now, real people don't live in neat rows, so let's mix them up. Okay, this is our hypothetical evenly divided state. Let's see what happens if the dimes draw the maps, 10 coins in each district. For the dimes, first thing we do is pack the pennies, give them 2 safe districts, but pack them solid. The remaining 8 districts are won by the dimes, by smaller but still comfortable margins. The dimes win 8 districts and the pennies win 2. The dimes overwhelmingly control the legislature. Of course, if the pennies drew the district lines, the opposite would be true. Let's rig it for the pennies. For the pennies, we follow the same pack and crack strategy. Pack the dimes into 2 safe districts and crack the remaining 8 districts to win by the same margin, 8-2. Well, now that we've destroyed democracy, let's consider what this map would look like if the districts were drawn for compactness and keeping communities of interest together. You get evenly divided districts in an evenly divided state. Some go heavily dime, some go penny, but that's to be expected. People live where they live, and that is what democracy is about. It's not about party bosses rigging election districts so they can fix the election results.
Thank you.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
what's so bad about safe districts, by the way? What's bad about it, of course, is that if you live in a safe district, there's almost no chance that you can change your representation. It's already been fixed beforehand.
If citizens
Oops.
cannot participate in the vote.
You can turn that off.
Sorry. Okay.
You got it, Chris?
No.
Okay,
You're
go to the top of the screen. You've got that tab next to line in the street. Up more. Nope, up at the very top.
Okay. More.
Day of action there.
Day of action, yeah. The tab at the top.
Right above gerrymandering.
I'm sorry.
Right
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
There you go.
Appreciate your patience with my my problem there. Okay, how can you get involved? We've talked about this a little bit more, but I want to reiterate it. It's that you've got to get informed and stay informed as to what the legislature is doing and what your legislators are doing. Again, you have your work cut out for you if you're represented by Democrats, because Democrats are in the majority. And I think it's fair to say the Salem Democrats are probably under tremendous pressure from the National Democratic Party, because the House of Representatives currently is managed by the Democrats by a handful of votes, a very close number. And the facts are that the Republicans control more state legislatures and governorships than the Democrats do. And the party that is in power has a tendency to use that power. And if that's correct, there will be more Republicans elected from newly drawn districts for the House of Representatives than Democrats. And it's simply a power play. It's as simple as that. So we have some interesting choices here. Let's put it that way. If you're a member of groups, whether it's the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, the Progressive Party, any kind, know what your group is doing and what is their stand on these issues and on redistricting. What information are they providing to you? Keep informed. You have the opportunity as a citizen of Oregon, a resident of Oregon, to testify yourself. And you may not know this, but you have the opportunity to testify. You don't have to go to Salem now. It is now being done with the miracle of Zoom that you can appear in a hearing and testify. Your time is going to be limited. You're only going to have 2 to 3 minutes. But if you think it through and prepare your remarks, you can say your piece in that period of time and get your point across. You also have the option of submitting written testimony, and there's no page limit to that. You can submit as much as you like. You can go onto the sites of the state legislative committees where you can see both the written testimony that's being submitted in the redistricting committee's public hearings, and you can also see the film of people testifying. There's lots of it. There are dozens of hours of it so far. And so you can see what's involved in that process. You can also do both. You can testify by Zoom. You can also submit your testimony in person. And the last item you can do, and we've alluded to this before, is you can draw your own maps. And there are programs out there that are free. There are programs out there that cost money. There's one called Dave's Redistricting. Dave's Redistricting is free. And right now it's got mostly recent data, ACS data. It hasn't got the census data, but they say the moment it arrives in August, it's going to be put in there. And you can use that to draw the 6 congressional districts, the 60 House districts, and the 30 Senate districts. And it's going to be a challenge to do so because there are as many possible maps in Oregon as there are atoms in the universe. Because again, none of those factors are rank ordered except for the federal standards, population. Where you draw the lines is going to be a balancing of things like communities of interest, district lines, whether it's county, city, maybe even school districts. And districts are inevitably going to cross lines, but certainly the thrust of the legislation is that they should cross as few lines as possible. So it's going to be very interesting. We're going to show you at least one map somebody already drew for the 6 congressional districts. You can get an idea what happened there. So let's go on from there. Take a look at what you have. These are the 2011 state house districts. Norman, do you want to explain what they did here?
Sure. Amanda, can you give me cursor control so I can point at things?
Oh, I think you can request control.
I can request screen share, but that's a bit.
Yeah, if you go up to the top, it should say you're viewing Chris Kobe's screen.
Yeah.
You can go view options and then request remote control.
Oh. All right. Chris will have to tell me.
Okay, you're clear.
Can you see my cursor moving?
You're cleared on this end.
Ah, there we go.
Yeah, okay. So this is the current state house districts. And you can say some interesting things here. For example, District 25 and 22 are long and skinny. This is not necessarily a gerrymandering, but the shapes are suspicious. Shape is just indicative of a possible gerrymander. It doesn't mean that it actually was. But what's interesting about this is that the legislature that drew these maps doesn't have to explain itself. Whereas if it was an independent redistricting commission, they have to justify every district that they draw and write up a little report on them. Why don't you go to the next one?
Okay. Let's see. Okay, let me go backwards. Let's go backward a little bit. Okay. Amanda, could you?
If you go to the hover spot, the lower left-hand corner, you can control the slides there.
Okay. Let's see. I'm sorry. Let me do this. There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
A quick comment on the Senate districts. Look at this one right here. I mean.
Yeah, that was my next thing.
Okay. All right.
So in Eastern Oregon, there's this District 30 that starts in the southeast part of the state and then goes all the way into Jefferson County and Bend in here, or actually Bend is below it, but it's kind of H-shaped. And that's another sort of suspicious thing that is happening. Go to the next slide. This is the congressional map. The interesting thing to see here is that there's 3 congressional districts that all jut into the metropolitan Portland area. And we imagine anyway that this is a attempt to get more liberal voters in those districts and make them more democratic. And this district that starts on the coast and goes through Salem all the way to the mountains. This line down the middle here is actually the Cascade Mountains. And that's a natural geographic boundary, but it breaks down in the lower part of the state because they needed more voters in the 2nd congressional district. So it goes across the mountains in southern Oregon and includes Medford and Ashland.
Okay.
Next one, this, as it says, is one person's concept of what might happen with the new congressional district. Here, Eastern Oregon and part of the mountains areas is part of the new district, and there's a district on the coast, and then there's 4 more districts that go down the valley. This would be maybe communities of interest better than others, but I doubt that the final map will look like this at all.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in this because a lot of the testimony in the redistricting hearings was the people in Eastern Oregon said, we want a district that represents rural people. That's fine, but there aren't too many people. And the person who drew this said that he heard there were a lot of people who wanted a coastside district. Right now it's broken into 3. This would put them all in 1. And then you have essentially a Klamath district down here that goes up the Willamette Valley of Eugene. And then you have one that's in the mid-valley, one that's in the suburbs. You can't see it very clearly on this map, but it's Washington and Clackamas County. And then essentially Portland is pretty much its own congressional district. It's almost exactly the size of a $700,000 congressional district. Barbara and Ashland asked, could we use the ACS data? You can use it, but you can't use it for the final maps. And it's not as precise as census data. It'll give you an idea, yes, but it's not necessarily going to give you, it certainly won't give you the granular detail that the census data, once released, will do. There are, in addition to Dave's redistricting, there's a program called Districtor, that is the word district with a small R in back of it. There's one called Maptitude. Norman mentioned that the state is using Esri and will allow you to be trained in that. So you have many different vehicles to draw your own maps. And you will find it to be a rather interesting, an interesting concept. The comment came up that ACS data is census data. It is, but it's based on I believe, not suppositions.
Estimates.
It's estimates and sampling and extrapolations. So it is a kind of census data, but it's not the final figures that we have to work with. So looking at that, if there are some questions, I want to do a couple of things, Norman, if you'll bear with me. One political commentator said, you want a gerrymander of Oregon? Okay, here's a gerrymander. And he was using available data here. If you wanted to elect as many Republicans as you possibly could in Oregon, you'd use a map maybe like this. What do we have here? See the blue in the upper left part of the state, 1, 5, and 3. Those would be the Democratic districts. Heavily Democratic Portland and the coast side, and then the area to the east and south, Clackamas and areas there. Those could be 3 districts. And the second would be solidly Republican. The 4th and 6th districts, less so, but probably Republican. Then the same pundit said, you want a Democratic district, a Democratic gerrymander? Take a look at this. This one would give the Democrats probably 5 out of 6 districts. The 2nd district in the lower part of the screen, that's the Republican district. It's rose colored. The 5 Democratic districts are light blue, the 4th and the 5th, darker blue, the 6th and the 1st, and then Portland, which is heavily Democratic, that's the 3rd one. One other comment I'd like to make is when you look at districting and what you can consider here, it's going to be, you're going to have to think of things like transportation, railroads, highways, airports. We have to have the transportation links between them. Another thing is, and this sometimes escapes people's notice, Oregon's population is not distributed evenly. This map shows you a dot for every 500 people. You can see where the population is. It's in Portland and it's in the Willamette Valley, a little bit in Bend, a little bit in Medford, a little bit in Ashland. That's it. And when people say, well, we need districts that are basically the same size, it doesn't work that way. So Norman, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think if the ACS data is used as sort of an estimate of what might happen, and then they get the final census data, that will be a quicker way to get the maps that they want. The population, as you said, is not well distributed, and so that will have to be taken into account. Let's see if there's any other questions before we go any farther, Chris.
Sure. Well, I think some people have said, okay, what about geological or geographic areas? And here's a map that shows you, if you're going to look at the layout of the state from a geographical perspective, on the western third of the state, you have the Coast Range, you have the Willamette Valley, you have the Cascade Mountains, and you have the Klamath Mountains down there. And that's where most of the population is. And to a certain extent, in redistricting, you're supposed to consider geographical features, but you're also supposed to consider political features. And here is a map of Oregon's 36 counties. Look at Lane County, which is on the coast, and it's light blue. It stretches from the coast all the way to the Coast Range. And so it's going to, the Lane County districts are going to violate the geographical ones because they cross one mountain range and get into a second one. And that's going to be true for a lot of the other counties, especially in the Willamette Valley. And so those considerations are something that has to be taken into account. One other illustration of sort of what we just saw was this map of urban and rural Oregon. Again, it's the Willamette Valley and the Portland area plus Ashland and Eugene and Salem. That's where the people are. So you're not going to get 6 equally sized districts from a geographical point of view. And if there are other items you can see, you'll have to consider those too. So the factors that are involved here are all, you might say, rather confusing. And so, Norman, are there really any bright line tests for redistricting?
Not really. It's a human activity using human judgment. And the important thing is that we appoint people that can do this kind of human judgment well enough using their wisdom. There is a question here.
Yeah.
Will you be updating us with another in-service in August and let us know when to testify? Absolutely.
That's right. And by then we will have more information for you, examples of written testimony, examples of oral testimony. It's not that hard once you prepare for it, and you can let the legislators know. The key thing here is that the legislature is listening. There's no question that they're listening. Whether it's registering is another matter entirely. And at the moment, when they draw the initial maps, you're not going to be involved. Okay, so Norman, do we want to leave him on a high note or a low note?
Well, all this could be rather confusing, but just be reassured that we're watching, and so you don't have to pay quite as much attention, but stay tuned for further updates. And we're happy to have seen all of you here attending, and thank you for your good questions.
Thank you.